Chapter 17 The Blue Dragon and Her Trojan Warrior. Minutes before midnight, December 14th, 2012. The Kremlin, Moscow. Just before the stroke of midnight, to a fanfare of distant gunfire, two soldiers appeared on the roof of the Kremlin. They approached a mighty flagpole where the blood-red banner of the Soviet Union flew in the crisp, cold air. As the flag was lowered, the yellow hammer and sickle flapped and thundered in the wind defiantly, as though the flag sought to escape its inevitable fate. Then, with a final movement of the hoist, the red banner vanished from view. In its place, a red, white, and blue tricolor rose above the Kremlin. Down on ground level, nearly 500 soldiers stood in the cold together. Behind them were 4 T-90 battle tanks. 2 of the tanks were flying the tricolor flag. The other 2 bore the Soviet banner. A truck pulled into the courtyard and the soldiers split apart, making a lane. A short man with a rounded face and pointed nose got out and started walking towards the Kremlin palace. Vladimir Putin, President of the Russian Federation, moved briskly towards his destination, where Arisha Kimoto, President of the Soviet Union, waited for him at the top of the stairs. Putin never took his eyes off Kimoto as he ascended. Behind him, the 2 Soviet flags were quietly removed from the T-90s. Putin came face to face with Kimoto and said, "Pobeda, victory." "Для кого?" Kimoto replied. "For whom?" This moment had been a long time coming. One republic after the next had withdrawn from the Soviet Union for the past year, but Russia's declaration of independence was a lethal blow. Arisha Kimoto was the ruler of a nation that only existed on paper. And just a few seconds after Putin joined her at the top of the Kremlin stairs, that nation ceased to exist. In its ultimate session, the upper house of the Soviet legislature, called the Soviet of Nations, passed a final law that terminated not just a legal entity, but a whole era of human history. The document, stamped with the final seal of the Soviet Union, said this: Declaration of the Council of Republics of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR in connection with the creation of the Commonwealth of Independent States. Based on the will expressed by the highest state bodies of Azerbaijan, Armenia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Moldova, the Russian Federation, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Ukraine, the USSR as a state and as a subject of international law ceases to exist. The office of President of the Soviet Union and the powers of the Supreme Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of the USSR are hereby extinct and abolished. The right to use nuclear weapons is transferred to the President of the Russian Federation. It was over. The Soviet Union was gone. December 15th, 2012, Kyobashi River, Minami Ward. The war continued. Soviet soldiers were still attacking Hiroshima from all sides, many of whom were completely unaware of the fact that the Soviet Union itself had ceased to exist mere moments ago. Some of the most senior officers in the Red Army knew what had just happened in Moscow. Artyom Sidorov, who was in overall command, accepted that the USSR had dissolved, but he refused to take orders from the President of Russia, arguing some bureaucratic point about the Russian government having no authority to command Soviet soldiers. Years later, Sidorov told me that he knew the war was lost and that he was just buying time to allow his soldiers to inflict as much damage on Japan as they could before a formal ceasefire could go into effect. In Hokkaido, the so-called People's Republic descended into chaos. Japanese people rose up against their occupiers en masse, taking advantage of the enemy's general state of disarray. The government of the so-called People's Republic seemed to just vanish off the face of the earth. Its membership scattered to the winds as they knew exactly what was coming their way. And in the besieged city of Hiroshima, the bloodbath carried on as though nothing changed at all. The Soviet army was now at the end of their rope. The enemy, still enraged by the nuclear attack on the Soviet fleet, was pushing forward, despite running out of all possible supplies: food, weapons, ammo, and even clothing. Right in the middle of all this was myself, Chihiro, Aaron, Kotori, and our certifiably insane plot. We weren't going to execute this plan by ourselves. While Kotori drove around the city, looking for a formation of Soviet vehicles to join, I was talking to Holly Smith on the radio. Stormbreaker 1 actual, this is Stormbreaker 2, I started. Do we have any friendly units on the far side of the Kyobashi River? Preferably near Hiroshima train station. Stand by, Stormbreaker 2, Holly's voice replied. We're talking with General Harper now. She thinks your plan is bloody batshit, but she's willing to run with it. A moment later, Holly called back. Okay, Stormbreaker 2, I've got someone for you. It's an American unit. Their commander's dead, so a sergeant and a chaplain are running it now. Stand by. Then another voice spoke up on our frequency. This is Staff Sergeant Corey Tucker, acting commander of the 223rd Military Intelligence Battalion, California National Guard. Call sign, Brown Bear 1 actual. Who am I talking to? Private First Class Blake Robinson, I replied. 13th Artillery Company, Japan Self-Defense Force. Call me Stormbreaker 2. We need help shutting down some enemy artillery. Robinson, replied Sergeant Tucker. You mean the president's kid? Hold on. Sergeant Tucker's voice faded for a moment and was replaced by someone I hadn't heard from in a while. Robinson, you're alive! It was James Cass, that disgusting son of a bitch from basic training. Icky, I exclaimed. Good to have a friend out here. Listen, a traitor gave away our big guns to the enemy. We need to find and shut down the Soviet artillery before they draw a bead on us. Can you help? Damn right we will, James said. We've been watching the Ruskies set up something on a nearby hilltop. Must be the guns you're looking for. What's your outfit like? Myself, 3 others, and a bunch of stuff we stole from the enemy, including a truck. Dude, James gasped over the radio. You could totally do the Troy thing. That's what I was thinking, I replied. If our traitor and those Russian guns are on that hill, we'll get the enemy to look the other way and you hit them from behind, okay? Sounds like a plan, replied the voice of Corey Tucker. Let me tell you guys about this hill. We followed Tucker's directions partway across town until we came to a huge forest-covered hill that was surrounded by cityscape on 3 sides and a river on the 4th. A gargantuan radio tower stood on top of the hill, overlooking the rest of Hiroshima. We dismounted from our stolen truck and climbed up to the top floor of an apartment building to get a better look. That's Hijiyama, Chihiro explained, pointing to the landmark. A small mountain. The mountain itself was covered in trees. Road signs told us that a city park occupied most of Hijiyama, but the summit was reserved for telecommunications operations. The 4 of us surveilled the mountain with binoculars. Yamamoto's definitely down there, Aaron said. I can see his truck. It's parked in that curve in the road, right before the tree line. Chihiro, Kotori, and I widened our search area. I gazed into the parking lot of a large-looking building located about halfway up the mountain. I spotted a familiar profile and gasped. BM-21s, I called out. Look, those are Soviet artillery pieces in front of the building. There were about 3 dozen of the highly mobile trucks, each one with a multiple rocket launcher system in its bed, ready to rain hellfire down on the city again. What does that sign say? Aaron asked. On the far side of the lot. What is that place? Kotori focused on a signpost in front of the parked BM-21s. I see the sign, she breathed. It's a research facility for, the effects of nuclear radiation. It even has a hospital complex attached. And all of their BM-21s are parked right in front of it. Bastards. We scanned the research facility again, looking for anything else of note. When Chihiro spoke again, we all jumped. "There he is!" Chihiro yelled. "That fucking creep!" Yutaka Yamamoto had just climbed out of a military ambulance and was talking to a woman on a stretcher. Yukiko Takahashi testified multiple times about what happened to her in the final days of the siege of Hiroshima to me, to my family, and to the GRTC. While her story has remained consistent over the decades, the accuracy of her statements was always called into question for the same reason. During those final days, Yukiko was going through a very rough awakening. Her gift was starting to show herself. And to the uninitiated observer, Yukiko would have appeared to be downright insane. At the moment when Chihiro, Aaron, Kotori, and I were staring at Hijiyama from afar, Yukiko was being unloaded from a Soviet military ambulance. She had to be restrained because she was flailing about. Not because of any physical injury, but mental torment. Yukiko was experiencing uncontrollable mind reading, one of the very first things that happens to a person when their gift is fully activated. Her consciousness was under telepathic bombardment from the thoughts, ideas, and fantasies of some 300 men around her. They manifested as voices and images that forced themselves to the forefront of her perceptions. Yukiko frightened Yukata by screaming, "Make it stop! Stop the voices, please!" Yutaka looked at his friend in genuine terror. He had no idea what was going on. "I think she was struck in the head," Yutaka told one of the Soviet medics. "Take her inside and bring me the artillery commander." Yukiko remembered being wheeled inside the building where she was triaged. She told me she was terrified of how many people suddenly started to think of her as being insane. She said she didn't really perceive words, but instead detected their thoughts as impulses, ripples, and shockwaves. Yukiko was taken inside of the hospital building, away from the parking lot full of artillery. She remembered being triaged inside of an office area, and that the Soviet medics were very alarmed when Yukiko said she could read their thoughts. To prove her point, Yukiko quoted, almost word for word, a sexual fantasy one of the men was having about her in that very moment. All 4 men told Yukiko to wait in the office while they contacted the relevant authorities. As I mentioned in an earlier footnote, the Soviet government was aware of psionics and the gift, so there was actually a relevant authority that could have been made aware of Yukiko's gift. It was a special council within the KGB, a Soviet spy agency, comparable to our own ISO in the modern day. However, in that moment, contacting them would have done no good. The Soviet Union had ceased to exist just a few hours before Yukiko's gift was discovered, and the KGB was in no state to receive communications from anyone. Their headquarters was being raided by the newly founded Russian army. So Yukiko sat there, in an office on the 2nd floor of the Hijiyama Hospital, and watched the BM-21 company out the window. Yutaka was trying to coordinate a strike against the Japanese, and used a tourist map of Hiroshima to point out the location of the 13th Artillery to the Soviet commander. She also observed a convoy of trucks enter the area, coming up a narrow road that wound its way through the trees. Now, here's the thing about psionics that younger generations don't seem to know. Mind reading is a natural part of telepathy, which means that some measure of lie detection is also included. This is because a brain that is actively engaged in deception behaves differently from one which is not. A skilled telepath can pick a liar out of a crowd with far more accuracy than a polygraph device. But there's one crucial detail history seems to have forgotten. If someone is a really bad liar, or if their deception is paper thin and easily seen through, then even the most unskilled of telepaths can detect that liar from a mile away. Yukiko detected one of us in that truck. Judging from her testimony, she must have picked up on either Eren or Chihiro, since those two had a much better track record for honesty than myself or Kotori. No matter which of us she initially detected, Yukiko was able to focus on us just enough to hear our thoughts through the general chaos of telepathic noise that was assaulting her mind. Okay, everyone, here's the plan, I was saying. We just need to get their attention. Don't get bogged down in a firefight. Keep moving. Give ground and fall back wherever you can. No heroics. Don't need to tell me twice, Kotori replied, raising her voice a little so Chihiro and I could hear her. Kotori and Eren were still in the cab. Chihiro and I hid beneath a tarp in the back of the truck, with our weapons ready. How long do we have to wait for Tucker and your friend Cass to get here? Eren asked. Not long at all, I replied. Tucker said he was going to ask his friend to call in a favor. Minato Park, Minami Ward. Corey Tucker, James Cass, and approximately 1,000 soldiers from the California National Guard were staging for an assault on Hijiyama about 3 miles away. Bradley fighting vehicles, armored trucks, and even a Chinook transport helicopter were gathered in the park, engines running. Meanwhile, the two Americans were looking at a third person with a mixture of skepticism and trepidation. This new individual was a very old man, dressed up in the uniform of a French military officer. In spite of his age, his eyes seemed to be full of energy. Are you sure your friends can pull through? James asked. Holding a military radio in one hand, the elderly officer nodded. The future Stormbreaker, named Ignatius Petoskey, had full confidence in his own comrades. I would trust these men with my life, Ignatius replied, and they would do the same for me. That is what makes the French Foreign Legion so great. A deep thudding sound came from the north. Turning to look, Corey, James, and Ignatius saw a squadron of attack helicopters flying low over the Hiroshima skyline, escorting a much heavier-looking transport helicopter. All of the airborne reinforcements were painted with the colors and insignia of France. Ignatius pumped his fist in the air and cheered, Vive la Légion étrangère! One of the French attack helicopters veered off from the group to chase away a Russian helo. Down on the ground, Corey Tucker and James Cass rallied their own troops. Mount up, boys! Corey yelled. We've got a date with Irisha Kimoto tonight! Hijiyama, Minami Ward. 2 Soviet soldiers began approaching the truck. It was parked at an odd angle, and the engine was still running. They thought they could see 2 people in the cab talking to one another. One of the enemy soldiers raised his eyebrow as he drew near and raised his voice. Comrade driver, the Russian called out. Are you lost? The window rolled down, and an Asian woman stuck her head out to talk. Comrade soldier, Kotori said in the best accent she could muster. We think something fell off the back of our truck. Can you look around the side for us? The 2 soldiers turned to walk around the back. They were so focused on the distance that they failed to notice the barrels of 2 rifles sticking out from underneath the canvas in the truck bed. 2 loud gunshots dispatched both men, and Chihiro and I jumped out. That would have been a boring conversation anyway, I mumbled. Then I yelled, Everyone out of the open! Get into that building! Eren, Kotori, Chihiro, and I broke cover and ran for the hospital building. Meanwhile, all around us, about 50 Soviets dove for cover at the first outburst of gunfire and were now frantically looking around, trying to see what was going on. We burst through the front doors and found our way inside. Well, we've got their attention. Eren raised his voice above a new round of gunfire. Now we've just got to hold it, Chihiro replied. She aimed her rifle through the shattered glass door and fired a volley towards the enemy. Several Soviets threw themselves towards the ground and started aiming their weapons at us. We fell back even further into the building, looking for cover. Eren tossed a smoke grenade into the lobby to mask our movements, while Chihiro kicked a vending machine onto its side and propped her rifle up on it. In seconds, we'd taken up a fortified position in the hospital lobby. Remember, I called out to the others, the second it looks like things are going south, turn tail and run. Don't waste your lives on a distraction. We could see the enemy through the doors and windows. We'd barely started our little operation, but it was already having the intended effect. Soviet artillery crews were spooked and had started packing up their equipment, refueling the BM-21s and preparing to move out. The artillery strike Yutaka wanted wasn't going to happen now. Meanwhile, Yamamoto himself waved his arms to flag down the driver of a BTR. "Americans in that building!" Yamamoto pointed out our positions. "First floor, light them up!" "Everyone put your heads down!" Chihiro screamed as the BTR turned its chain gun on us. Meanwhile, on the second floor, Yukiko Takahashi was thrown from her chair by the first jarring concussion. Each blast from the BTR's chain gun caused the building to shake and tremble as though it was going to fall down. Afterward, Yukiko told me that the sounds of our thoughts were so loud in her mind that they actually threatened to drown out the sounds of weapons fire. Even though her mind was under an intense telepathic bombardment, Yukiko found the strength to scramble back to her feet, burst through the office door, and dash through the hall, away from the chaos. "Here they come again!" Aaron shouted. "Let them have it!" A group of Russian infantry made another attempt to storm the hospital lobby. Heavily armed men came in through the now obliterated glass doors, only to be pushed back outside by a volley of intense gunfire. Aaron was using the reception desk for cover, firing over the countertop. Kotori was in the very back of the lobby, lying on her belly and squeezing off one round at a time. Chihiro was hiding behind several gurneys piled on top of one another, poking the barrel of her rifle through a gap. And I was only a short distance behind her, standing in an office door, pointing my own rifle around the threshold. The gunfight was fierce and intense. Our little team was trying to make 4 soldiers feel like 4 dozen. We chucked every grenade we had and sent hundreds of bullets into the enemy, all the while backing up one person at a time. Chihiro would fall back while the 3 of us covered her, and then Aaron would give ground under covering fire. We withdrew from the lobby, leaving behind a claymore mine to delay pursuit. As we sprinted down the hallway, I pulled out my radio and called our compatriots. "This is Stormbreaker 2, I panted. "We've made contact with enemy artillery elements on the high ground at Hijiyama. Does anyone want to join this party?" "Stormbreaker 2, replied the voice of Corey Tucker. "Elements of the French Foreign Legion and California National Guard are en route to you. ETA 2 minutes. You'd better shelter in place." "Don't gotta tell me twice." Aaron skidded to a stop and started pointing at the rooms around us. "Let's hide in one of these." Chihiro pointed to a heavy-looking door with a lot of warning labels on it. "That's a radiation room," she said, reading the signs. "It's got reinforced lead walls." "Might as well be bulletproof," I said. "Everyone inside." Peace Park, Minami Ward. The remaining howitzers of the 13th Artillery never made it to their new assigned positions. On Holly's orders, the gun crews dismounted from their trucks and set up the cannons in the wide-open space of the Peace Park, just southwest of the Atomic Dome. When Corey and I were talking on the radio, Holly was being delivered some unexpected news. Soylent Green ran across the ground at high speed, almost colliding with Holly in his haste. "She's gone," he panted. "She just ran off." "Who ran off?" Holly asked. "That Tsubaki girl." "No, not her," Soylent replied. "Yamada." At some point before arriving in the Peace Park, Akira Robinson broke off from the 13th and went into the city on her own. She would turn up again shortly. Back at Hijiyama, we could hear the dull thudding noise of approaching helicopters, and a moment later, the whole building rattled violently. The French had arrived. The 4 of us had taken shelter inside some kind of radiology lab, filled with advanced-looking scientific equipment. Chihiro had found an emergency wash basin and used her bayonet to break off a large piece of the mirror above it. Then she taped the mirror shard to the end of her rifle and used it to peek into the hallway. "It's clear," she reported back. "What now?" Kotori asked. "Our job's done," I replied. "Corey, James, and their buddies can handle this now. Let's find a way to get out of here and back to the 13th. Outside, the assault on Hijiyama was now in full swing. Our plan had worked perfectly. The enemy was so distracted by my team's little escapade in the hospital that the Russians were caught completely off guard. American soldiers smashed their way through the first few lines of defense and were soon close enough to render the Soviet artillery useless. Hundreds of enemies were overwhelmed and cut down in the initial assault. The French carried out an air attack from their helicopters, while nearly 1,000 American infantry came straight up the hill en masse. Soviet artillery crews were caught completely unprepared and never got the chance to bring their guns to bear. James Cass stayed close to Corey Tucker and Ignatius Petoskey, and all three advanced together through the heavily forested mountain. The air was so thick with bullets that small trees were torn from the ground and tumbled down the mountainside. Americans were forced to crawl on their hands and knees up the hillside to avoid being shot, while the Soviets on the summit found themselves caught between a metaphorical rock and a hard place. Americans attacking on one side, and the French coming from the air. Helicopters swooped low, firing missiles and miniguns into the Russian forces. BM-21s vanished into plumes of black smoke, while enemy soldiers fell by the dozen as they scrambled for cover. About 30 feet below the summit of the mountain, James, Corey, and Ignatius were forced to take cover as a Soviet soldier opened fire on them with a heavy machine gun. James raised his voice and shouted to about 50 American soldiers who were advancing up the hill, "It's a PKM! Get down!" The enemy machine gun roared loudly, spitting fire, and led towards the hunkered attackers. James reached into his pouch and produced a hand grenade. He pulled the pin, counted to 2, and then tossed it. A loud crack was followed by a rain of dirt and debris. The enemy machine gun fell silent, and James took that as his cue. He stood up and yelled, "Okay, boys, let's go!" James, Ignatius, and Corey all sprang up and joined their comrades in one last push up to the slope. "Charge!" an American yelled. "Give 'em hell!" "Banzai!" a Japanese hollered. "7 lives for the fatherland!" A mass of Allied soldiers surged over the hilltop and took it by storm. The Russians were overwhelmed and felled 5 or 6 at a time. In mere moments, there were just 2 Soviet soldiers left on the summit of Mount Hijiyama. 20 years later, one of them would survive to become an XCOM soldier and a good friend of mine during the Second Hyperspace War. We fought together during the battle for Earth, and she even survived the war in heaven. Anna Petrova was a low-ranking Russian conscript at the time, and said that she was so shocked and surprised when 50 Americans breached her position that she lost the willpower to open fire. When he crested the hilltop, James Cass pointed his rifle at a spot right between Anna's eyes. But he saw Anna lower her rifle. James transitioned to another target and left her alive. A second later, a Soviet officer screamed in Anna's ear, "What are you doing, you coward? Shoot already!" Panicking, Anna pointed her rifle into the oncoming horde of Americans and fired twice. James dropped his weapon, clutching at his liver. Blood spurted from 2 wounds in the right side of his gut. Then he collapsed to the ground and fell most of the way back down the hill, coming to rest face down in a gully. Ignatius Petoskey turned around and ran to help James, while Corey Tucker unholstered a pistol and took aim at Anna. "Wait!" she shouted. Corey fired 3 times. His first 2 shots hit the Soviet officer directly behind Anna, dropping him instantly. The third round hit and broke Anna's right arm, causing her to fall in agony. She threw her rifle aside and gasped, "I surrender! Don't kill me, please!" Decades later, when Corey and Anna were serving together aboard the Avenger, Corey admitted over drinks that he seriously considered killing Anna while she was helpless, even though she'd already surrendered. He also said his decision to spare Anna's life was based entirely on the fact that he was under the impression James Cass was still alive. If Corey knew that James bled to death less than a minute after being shot, he would have blown Anna's head off. Anna herself said she would have deserved it. All of this happened about 50 yards away from Chihiro, Kotori, Aaron, and myself. We burst out from the back entrance of the hospital and found ourselves at the bottom of a small trail that led directly to the summit. "We don't want to go that way," Kotori said. "The Russians are probably up there." "Let's double back to the river," Aaron suggested. "Then we can cross and—" The loud report of gunfire cut him off. We all scrambled for cover as somebody opened fire on us. "Behind us!" Chihiro ran towards the door we'd exited from and slammed it shut. Just before the door sealed, we all heard the voice of Yutaka Yamamoto. "That's the princess! She's right there! Take her alive!" I pointed to our right. Several BM-21s were parked along the side of the road, engines running. "That's our ride!" All four of us sprinted towards the road. Above us, a French helicopter spotted us and turned to lay down suppressing fire on a nearby Soviet position. "Brown Bear 1 actual, this is Falcon 5-3. The helo pilot spoke into his radio. "We have eyes on your Stormbreakers. They just stole an enemy vehicle and are moving south down the hill." A moment later, the pilot corrected himself. "2 vehicles now. They've stolen a pair of Russian trucks and are making for the Kyobayashi River at best speed." All four of us crammed into the same truck cab and sped away. While I was driving, Aaron was in the front passenger seat. Kotori and Chihiro were crammed in the middle, forced to keep the control system for the rocket launcher in their laps. Before we took off, Aaron used a piece of chalk to draw a big white cross on the top side of our truck. Then he got on the radio. "This is Stormbreaker to all American, Japanese, and French units. We've stolen an enemy vehicle and are exfiltrating to the west. Do not engage the BM-21 with white X's on it." "We see you, Stormbreaker," replied a French pilot. "What about that second truck behind you? Are they with you?" My heart dropped into my stomach. Aaron poked his whole head out the window, looking back, and shouted, "It's a Ural! Someone's chasing us down! Another truck behind them, about 200 yards. I slammed my foot onto the gas pedal, but a truck can only go so fast when there's a fully loaded rocket launcher mounted onto its bed. Struggling to do more than 35 miles per hour, I called out to Chihiro and Kotori. "We're bogging down here! Lighten the load!" Kotori turned her head to look out the rear window. Then she put one hand on the controller. The massive turret in the back of the truck started to swivel, and I nearly lost control of the wheel for a moment as the weight shifted around. "What are you doing?" I cried out as the truck nearly overbalanced and tipped over. "Lightening the load," Kotori replied, "and hopefully getting rid of some of those guys." As we roared out of the Hijiyama Park and back into Hiroshima proper, we were surrounded by cityscape once more. Kotori only released the controller when the rocket launcher was facing backwards, pointing towards the pursuing truck. "Tachibana-san, do it!" Kotori ordered. Chihiro pressed a bright red button on the controller and unleashed hell. This time I really did lose control of the truck as all 40 barrels in the rocket launcher started to spit fire and lob projectiles downrange. The two trucks chasing us both slammed on their brakes as several dozen rockets sailed forth, chaotically smashing into anything and everything. A bookshop exploded into millions of little shards. A whole section of roadway flew into the air and came back in a hailstorm of pieces. The trees were reduced to kindling. The rear wheels of our BM-21 came off the ground and I lost all control. The truck turned sideways and collided with the front entrance of a post office before rolling over onto its side, firing 2 final rockets into the sky and falling silent in a cloud of dust and smoke. I don't remember the crash all that well, but I do remember being woken up by someone tugging on my arm, and the smells and sounds of flowing water. Opening my eyes, I realized we were just short of the Surumi Bridge, which spanned the Kyobashi River. Our truck was embedded nose first into the front of a hardware store, and the safety of the Japanese-controlled Naka ward was mere meters away. A lone Japanese soldier was running across the bridge towards us. "Get up!" Aaron said. "Come on, everyone. We gotta move fast before the Ruski's shock wears off." Against all odds, Aaron, Kotori, Chihiro, and I were alive. We were pretty badly beaten and bruised from the wreck, but when I saw what happened to the rest of our truck, I was amazed we weren't killed. The entire rear section was blown away. The rocket launcher was blasted into many little bits strewn over the place, and one piece of shrapnel was embedded in Kotori's helmet, which lay on the ground about 50 feet from where the BM-21 came to rest. Some distance off, further up the road, 2 Soviet trucks were stopped. I couldn't see any people near them, and a moment later it became clear why. The sound of a bullet whizzing mere inches from my head made me freak out. I grabbed Chihiro and Aaron, pulling them down behind the safety of our shattered vehicle. Kotori followed us into cover a moment later, abandoning the attempt to retrieve her helmet from the middle of the street. Then we heard a voice. The last voice any of us wanted to hear right now. "Princess Asami of Chiako, we know you're there. Come out with your hands above your head." "Son of a bitch, it's Yamamoto," Aaron gasped. "What does he want you for, Tachibana?" "Stupid political stuff," Chihiro said. "Says they'll treat me nicely if I publicly support them." "After everything he's done," Kotori seethed, "I'd rather put a bullet in his brain." "Get in line," I finished. "Everyone give me a weapons check." Kotori had lost her rifle and was using a pistol. She had only one magazine with a few rounds. Aaron's rifle was fully loaded, but he had no spare ammo. Chihiro had lost both of her weapons, and she took a pistol from the BM-21's cupboard. I had my own rifle, but there were only 5 rounds left in the magazine, and I had nothing to spare. Gunfire sounded again, but this time there was no snaps or pops of bullets flying towards us. Looking around, we saw that Yutaka and the Russians were shooting at the lone Japanese soldier who was trying to reach us. She was pinned down on our side of the Tsurumi Bridge and couldn't move. The Japanese soldier pulled a long white fabric from her cargo pocket. Yutaka Yamamoto's voice sounded again, sounding tinny as though he was speaking over an electric loudspeaker. "Do not try to fight, Princess. My men are surrounding you as I speak. You have nowhere to run." Chihiro wasn't listening. She pointed towards the bridge and the lone friendly soldier pinned down on it. "Is that Yamada?" Chihiro gasped. "How'd she get all the way over here by herself?" Sure enough, it was Nanako Yamada out there. But now we know this was really Akira Robinson. She was no longer being shot at. The white cloth she'd been carrying was now draped over the side of the bridge, a message written on it in Japanese for the enemy to see. "Doesn't matter," I said, forming a new plan in my mind. "She's better than no help at all. Everyone, get inside that building and barricade." We crossed the street and forced our way inside of a relatively intact-looking structure. Behind us, Yutaka's voice rang out. "You have nothing to fear from surrender, Princess. Tell your friends they shall be given food and warm clothing if they give themselves up with you." Aaron and Kotori ran upstairs to look for elevated firing positions, while Chihiro and I tipped over a filing cabinet and blocked the door. "I don't get it," she said. "How is trapping ourselves in here going to help?" "They really seem to want you alive," I replied, "which means Yamamoto isn't going to risk doing anything like burning the building down or using grenades. They'll have to come in after us, which gives us the advantage. Plus," I pointed to the western wall, "there's another building adjoining this one. We have a way out." My guess turned out to be right. During the chaos of our BM-21 firing rockets everywhere, the neighboring building was hit and partially demolished. The 4 of us would be able to crawl through a hole in the wall and reach it. Then it was just a short dash to the Tsurumi Bridge and safety. The 4 of us set about fortifying the staircase when the thudding of helicopter blades and chatter of gunfire reached our ears. A moment later, the French helo pilot called to my radio. "Stormbreaker, if you're inside that building on Hijiyama Avenue, you need to stay put," the French pilot told me. "The Soviets have you surrounded. We've dropped about a dozen of them when we flew past, but there's plenty left." "Copy all," I said grimly. Down below, a huge thump came from the front door. "Here they come," I called out. The 4 of us gathered at the top of the stairs, looking down at a veritable sea of furniture and wreckage we'd thrown down the steps, making ascent obscenely difficult. Aaron was still huffing and puffing from the effort of throwing half a sofa into the stairway, but he pulled a hand grenade from his pocket with a satisfied grin. "Last one," he said as he pulled the pin, flipped the spoon, and gave the explosive a gentle, underhanded toss. Chihiro, Aaron, Kotori, and I all dove for cover behind a wall as just a moment later the front door was smashed open and several Soviet soldiers forced their way into our building. They never saw the little bomb at their feet. The detonation threw all of us into the air. The whole structure rocked as though it had been knocked off its foundation. Dust fell from the ceiling and timbers groaned dangerously. Then the gunfire started again. The outside walls exploded with dust as they were perforated violently. We all hit the ground as Russian soldiers fired on our little safe house from all sides, and Yutaka's voice cried out nearby, "Cease fire! Cease fire! We need to capture, not kill!" "That's our cue," I hissed to the others. "Out the back and across the bridge, now!" Aaron went first, wriggling his way through the open wall, making sure to break one of the wall studs, widening the gap for the rest of us. Kotori was next, but as she was clambering through the hole, a slamming sound and clatter on the stairway told us that someone was ascending to the second floor. "Princess Asami!" Yutaka's voice called out. "Wait!" He sounded like he was desperate. Later on, we found out he actually was. The future life he was promised in the Soviet Union was dependent on whether or not he delivered Chihiro to the so-called People's Republic. And none of us, not even Yutaka, knew the Soviet Union had collapsed several hours ago. Without thinking or a word to one another, Chihiro and I raised our weapons and took aim at the landing. The second we saw some kind of movement, we opened fire. She fired every bullet in her pistol's magazine, and I squeezed off 3 rounds from my rifle, leaving just 1 in the chamber and 1 in the magazine. The wall on the far side of the staircase was absolutely shredded. Drywall powder rained down on Yutaka as he held his position and called out to us. "Princess, listen to me. We know the Japanese government has disavowed you. We knew you need someone to protect you and keep you safe. You're all alone out here and you need me." My blood was boiling. I stepped around the corner for the briefest of moments and shouted, "She is not alone!" I took aim and fired a single round at Yutaka before dashing back to safety again. Much to my anger, I missed, most likely because of my anger. Yutaka slipped on a wooden chair and fell partway down the stairs again. Before I retreated, I could see at least 5 more Russian soldiers behind him. "Robinson!" Yutaka's voice sounded strained and furious. "Princess, you can't be serious. He's a gaijin. What foreigner can care for you more than one of your own people?" Chihiro fired her pistol twice in Yutaka's general direction before turning to follow Kotori, who was all the way through the hole now. Chihiro was so small and skinny that she slipped through the narrow passage with no real delay. I fired my last round at the stairway to discourage Yutaka, then fled, leaving my rifle behind as I passed into the next room. What I found was very, very confusing. Chihiro, Aaron, Kotori, and Nanako Yamada were all there. But so were about 10 Soviet soldiers. My heart froze. I looked around in a panic for a second before I realized something. Everyone was standing still, looking at one another uncomfortably. And Nanako was holding a white tablecloth above her head as though it was a white flag. All of the enemy soldiers were holding their weapons loosely at their sides and looking more exhausted than anything else. Nobody looked like they were about to start a fight. One of the Russians, an officer, looked up at me forlornly and said, "Voya okochenya." Nanako looked over at me and spoke softly. "War's over, Blake. Let's go home." Nanako kept the white flag raised above her head as she escorted the 4 of us out of the ruins and towards Tsuromi Bridge. The night air was disturbingly silent. No gunfire, explosions, or whistling of mortars. It was as though the city had suddenly died. Clouds parted to reveal the moon and stars, illuminating our path forward. We were about halfway across the bridge when one of us found their voice again. "What happened?" Kotori asked in a small voice. Did we surrender? No, Nanako replied. The Russians are going home. What? Chihiro gasped. Just like that? Their government collapsed. Their country is coming apart at the seams. The truth dawned on Aaron first. So we won? Before anyone could realize the full implications, a commotion behind us caused all of us to stop and turn around. Yutaka Yamamoto was running towards us, a pistol clutched in his hand. He looked far angrier than I'd ever seen him before. At least a dozen Soviet soldiers were chasing after him, all shouting for Yutaka to stand down and come back. At least 2 of the enemy were waving white flags of their own above their heads and looking around nervously for Japanese snipers. "Princess!" Yutaka called out. "Princess, you must come with us!" Chihiro put her hands on her hips, one hand fingering her own pistol. "You have got to be kidding me!" Chihiro spat. "The war's over, you pathetic, treasonous cretin!" 2 Soviet soldiers tried to grab Yamamoto and hold him back, but he broke free of their grip and continued advancing on Chihiro. Moving quickly, Aaron and I stepped in front of her, blocking his way. Aaron pressed a 9mm pistol into my empty hand. "Back off, Yamamoto," I said. "It's over. It's all over." Unfortunately for us, Yutaka Yamamoto lost his life during the War in Heaven in September 2036, meaning we can't get a full explanation of his actions from him. Yukiko Takahashi was the one who made me aware of his motivations here, of the promise Yutaka received from the Soviet government, a position of power, wealth, and authority within the new People's Republic. If only he turned Chihiro Tachibana over to them. The People's Republic would have its puppet ruler, and Yutaka probably would have been the puppet master. On that dark night, on the Surumi Bridge, none of us knew that. We thought Yutaka had just lost his mind, or that the Russians were giving him some insane final orders to end the war on a strong note. What we did know is that this traitor had sold us all out to the enemy, with the heaviest price tag appearing to be for Chihiro. Now he was pointing his pistol at Aaron, Chihiro, and I, and making threats. "I don't give a damn," Yutaka hissed. "I don't get what's mine without you, and I'll be damned if I don't see a single reward for everything I've done for my new country." There was a tense moment as every person on the bridge raised their weapons again. The air was full of clicking as some soldiers turned off their safety switches as a warning. I stared down the barrel of my pistol, looking directly into Yutaka's eyes. He seemed almost dazed, like a man who'd come so close to winning it all, only to fall short just before the finish line. A shuffle of footsteps nearby told me that Nanako Yamada had just appeared on my right. The paradox was the only person on that bridge who knew how the standoff was going to end. Everything was proceeding according to her design. "You sold my friends," Chihiro seethed, "just so you could get some cushy reward?" "What were you expecting?" Aaron hissed. "Money? A house? Her?" "Makes sense," I said. "After what your friends did to Iwasaki and Newberry?" "And me too," Kotori added in a dark tone. "Is that what you want, Yamamoto? Taking a plaything back to Russia with you?" "You're disgusting," Nanako added. Our words had some unexpected power. The other Russians must not have been in on Yutaka's plot to kidnap Chihiro, because they were turning on him one by one. While Yutaka seethed angrily, each of the Soviet soldiers lowered their weapons in turn before moving to grab him instead. "Let go of me!" Yutaka snarled. "I'm not leaving here without her." "That's not up to you, selfish prick," I replied. I reached out and felt Chihiro grab my hand. She latched onto me very tightly. Yutaka looked at us with blinding fury before he was forcefully turned away by his new comrades. A Soviet officer nodded deftly at us and lowered his rifle. We lowered our weapons in kind and breathed a sigh of relief. Then Kotori swore. "I kinda wish the war hadn't ended," she said under her breath. "I really wanted to kill him." "Me too," I muttered. "Me three," Chihiro added. We all turned to leave. The Japanese-controlled Minami Ward was just a few meters away, at the far end of the bridge. Several friendly soldiers were already on their way out to meet us. "So, what are we going to do now?" I started to ask. The completed sentence never left my mouth. Behind us, there was the sound of a scuffle. As I started to look over my shoulder, I heard Yutaka shout, "You ungrateful bitch!" And then there was a single gunshot. Chihiro stopped walking and said, "Oh," in the smallest voice, before she crumpled to the ground, blood streaming from the right side of her neck like a river. The bridge was suddenly alight with chaos. Muzzle flashes lit the darkened river. Pops and snaps filled the air as a full-fledged gunfight ensued. The Japanese were no longer on the defensive. Dozens of men and women surged across the bridge, firing into the backs of the retreating Russians. I scooped up Chihiro's pistol from the ground and put my free hand on her neck, trying to stem the bleeding. She looked up at me, gasping and crying. "It hurts," she sobbed. "It hurts." Once again, I felt as though my whole body was consumed in flame. My rage was so hot I probably could have spit fire in that moment. Looking up, I saw Yutaka Yamamoto. He was on the far end of the bridge, fighting with the other Japanese soldiers. I wasn't thinking. I was lost in my own fury. I let go of Chihiro and took 2 steps forward. I raised her pistol and took aim. Yutaka was almost 100 yards away, just outside the effective firing range of a 9mm Beretta. I put him in the center of my sights and pulled the trigger as fast as I could, emptying the magazine in a matter of seconds. 14 bullets shot past Yutaka, missing him by inches. The 15th round struck home, hitting him squarely in the chest. Yutaka hunched over and collapsed to the ground. A few seconds later, about 50 Japanese soldiers overran the Russian line and forced the enemy to retreat. The last time I saw him, Yutaka was being carried away by 2 Soviet soldiers. The fight ended as the last of the Soviets fled back into occupied Hiroshima. Meanwhile, Japanese army medics arrived and pushed me away from Chihiro. One of the medics took stock of the wound in her neck and said, "Tachibana-san, you have lost a dangerous amount of blood. You need an immediate transfusion." Then he grabbed her military ID tags, read her blood type, and looked around at all of us. The medic shouted, "She's type A positive! We need a donor!" Nanako Yamada turned on her feet and looked directly at me. Her blue eyes seemed to just drill straight into my soul. Looking back on it now, I'm not sure what the paradox was trying to do. She may have been trying to change my mind, or perhaps give me the strength to follow through on an idea I already had. Either way, I broke contact with her, rolled up my sleeve, and said, "Here, I'm type A positive. I'll be the donor."